Good morning. Hope everything's going well with you all today. It's Happy Friday, June 5th. We're going to be working today on some information about Gregor Mendel. You should have just finished watching a little video about Gregor Mendel and his history, his life, his interests, why he got involved with genetics to begin with. And hopefully this will be a little bit more interesting to you as a result. We're going to be doing something similar to what we did on Wednesday, which is creating a lab report for an historic series of experiments that Mendel carried out back in the mid-1800s. So, who loves peas? This guy, Gregor Mendel, as they said in the video, was a monk who was living in a monastery, working in the garden where they did experiments, and was interested in genetics, interested in how different plants and animals, for that matter, and people were able to transfer their genetic material from one generation to the next. How did you inherit what made you you? That's what he was interested in. So he started investigating peas because, if you think about it, it makes sense to investigate something that has a short life cycle. And peas have a short enough life cycle that you could actually grow several generations worth of peas in a year's time, or in a growing season's time. And at the time that he was experimenting with this, the assumption was that all organisms, they discussed this on the video, inherited what made them unique as a result of some process. They didn't know what. They didn't know anything about genetics. They didn't know anything about how the cell worked or anything like that. So, he was just kind of trying to figure this out without all of the benefit of even the terminology that we use nowadays. And so whatever, a plant or an animal or a person was in the way that they thought about things at that time was a result of the blending of traits from the parents. And they thought that outcomes really couldn't be predicted, that they were just, they were what they were, you got what you got, and there wasn't anything really that you could, any way to predict what you might have when you crossed two different individuals, or what might be possible or might not be possible. So Mendel was investigating that particular mechanism, which he created the whole basis for what we now know as the field of genetics. And it makes me wonder, if he had been alive and had access to the things that we have now, how much different would our understanding be, and how much further could he have gone? All right, so after he did, like I said, and like they said in the video, he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tests with nearly 10 years of multiple generation tests every year, lots of data. And remember, with data, what are you going to do? You're going to analyze the data and come up with explanations. And that's exactly what he did. So he was able to even show that when you're talking about what we call a monohybrid, which means just looking at one particular trait, or a dihybrid trait, or dihybrid cross, which would be two traits, you could actually get a mathematical formula for predicting what would be possible with each generation. So now, once again, you need to pull out your paper, pull out your pencil, be sure you put your name on your paper, and we're going to go through this lab. And again, I want you to copy exactly what's going on here so that you have some good ideas about how lab papers are done, because next week we're going to be starting to work on a lab paper, and you're going to be expected to figure out these kinds of things on your own, okay, and how you would write them yourself. So with that in mind, let's go to the first thing that you're going to fill out, which is the title. So the title of this is Mendel's Pea Plants and the Inheritance of Traits, because that's what he was looking at. He was looking at how traits are inherited from one generation from the parents, and how they're passed on from one generation to the next. So Mendel, M-E-N-D-E-L, is the way you spell his name, pea plants. So he's looking at peas and the inheritance of traits. Give you a couple of seconds to get that caught up. And then remember, when we're talking about the hypothesis here, he had no idea about how cells worked or how genetics worked. And so he was really, truly forming an investigation based on no research, only observations that he could have made in his garden or in the garden there at the monastery. So the hypothesis is that inherited traits, this is the thing that he thought, was that the traits were controlled and they were predictable if it was possible to know what traits parents were passing on. So remember in the video, they talked about some different things that he looked at. He looked at the height of plants. He looked at the color of blossoms. He looked at the kinds of peas that they produced, whether they were wrinkled or smooth. He looked at colors of peas. And so, sometimes yellow peas were produced, sometimes green peas were produced. But that's what he was looking at, is the variety of different things, different inherited traits. So again, the hypothesis is that inherited traits were controlled and predictable if it was possible to know what traits are passed on by the parents. Let's look at the next one, the independent variable. So the independent variable were the plants that he actually used based on their physical traits to be crossed, in other words, to be bred together to create hybrids. Now, hybrid means a unique new individual. Okay, it's a cross between two things, like if you cross red Labrador or brown Labrador Retriever and a blonde Labrador Retriever. You don't necessarily get just brown and blonde. You can get black, you can get different shades of brown, you can get blonde, but we're looking at the physical traits, this time though, in plants. So depending on what you crossed, your dependent variable, remember that's the result. These are the things you're going to see as a result of what you manipulated. So he chose plants that were tall and short, or he chose plants that had maybe white blossoms and pink blossoms, or he chose plants that had produced smooth peas and plants that produced wrinkled peas, right? And so the dependent variable is the offspring that are produced when the plants were crossed. So what did he get? When he manipulated, and he did this because they did understand that pollen got transferred from plant to plant. They understood the role of bees and that it was necessary. So instead of using bees, he did the pollinating himself. And we see this happen in different parts of the world where people can pollinate plants to create different kinds of varieties of, especially exotic plants. It's done by hand, and that's exactly what he did. He manipulated it by intentionally crossing the pollen from one plant to another. Okay, so far you should have the title is Mendel's Pea Plants and the Inheritance of Traits. The hypothesis is that inherited traits are controlled and predictable if it's possible to know the traits that are passed on by the parents. The independent variable was the plants that he actually chose based on their physical traits to be crossed to create the hybrids. And then the dependent variable was the actual offspring or the actual hybrids that were produced when the parent, we call it the parent generation, was crossed. All right? So the results. What did he discover over these years and years and years and thousands of plants? What he discovered was that there were things, what he referred to as dominant and recessive traits that were passed on in mathematically predictable patterns. So remember they talked about crossing, and we'll talk more about this next week, so I'm not too concerned about you knowing a specific way that this works yet, but you're going to make a diagram of it for today. Mendel crossed pea plants, make sure you write this down, to determine the dominant and recessive traits that were passed on in mathematically predictable patterns. All right? So now, remember last time with Galileo, with the cannonballs, you drew a picture. All right, so for this one, what I'm going to ask you to do is diagram a monohybrid. So we're talking about one trait that's being investigated, a monohybrid cross. And you're going to draw something that looks like it is a Punnett, P-U-N-N-E-T-T, Punnett square. Now don't worry about knowing that word. We will learn the terminology that goes with that when we deal with genetics. But here are your two choices. So let me explain what this is. On the left-hand side, you have two parents. One is a yellow pea plant. So in other words, it produces yellow peas, and the other is a green pea plant. And we know that yellow is dominant because yellow is a capital letter. The Y is a capital Y, right? So we know that yellow is dominant and green is recessive. And notice what you're going to get if you cross this particular cross with a parent that has a yellow gene and a green gene. That is typically, when you're talking about that laid out this way, that indicates the mother. The mother is always listed on the left-hand side. The father is listed across the top. So in this case, the father can only pass on green genes. Green genes, the gene for green peas is what we call recessive. And so the father can only contribute recessive genes to all of the offspring. So every offspring is going to have a green, and then depending on what the mother gives, the offspring are either going to have a yellow gene to go with the green from the father, or a green gene to also go with the green from the father. And so in this case, in the one on the left, you have a 50-50 chance of having offspring. So it's 2 out of 4 chance of having offspring that are yellow, and a 2 out of 4 chance, or 50-50 chance, that your offspring are going to be green. So this is what we mean when we say a mathematically predictable model, right? Now, if you look at the other one, you have rabbits, and both of the rabbits have genes. If you see, there's a capital F there and a little f there on both of the parents. That means that both, and this is evidently a gene that codes for color, right? And so the mother is able to give a gene for the dark color and the light color, and the father is able to give a gene for the dark color and the light color. And when you combine the dark and the light, because the dark is dominant, then the rabbit is going to be dark. If you combine two that are lowercase f, the small f, that means that that's the only thing that that rabbit inherited, then it can't be anything but white. And so here you have a 3 out of 4, or a 75% chance that you're going to have black rabbits, and a 25 or 1 in 4 chance, 25% or 1 in 4 chance that your offspring are going to be white. Now that doesn't mean, and we'll talk about this some later, that doesn't mean that they're actually going to come out like that. It just means that over time, your offspring, chances are going to be about that ratio. Okay, so you choose the one that you want to put down. Leave this up as long as possible, as long as you need to, in order to copy this at the bottom for your example. There's no need to hurry. There's no need to rush. Just leave it open and get it copied. And I'll look for your papers when I pick them up next week, and we'll be having some fun with different genetic puzzles as we study genes and Mendel's inheritance theory. So have a good weekend.